Welcome to the Fleet Geeks podcast. We're here to help develop fleet and transport professionals. Do you want to progress and develop your skills and knowledge? We promise to bring lively conversation and debate around interesting issues and keep you bang up to date with changes in our awesome industry. The Fleet Geeks are a community of professionals, and if you enjoy the podcast, why not join the discussion for free in the Fleet Geek community over on Facebook?
Excellent. So the red light is rolling and the recording started. Hello, listeners. Thank you for joining us today and tuning into the podcast. I'm absolutely delighted to have Lisa Dorn join me today for the podcast. Hi, Lisa. And we're going to be talking today. Well, she's actually fantastically, she's agreed to do, well, hopefully she'll carry on agreeing to do it after this first one. Hopefully I don't make a mess of it, but she's kindly agreed to do 3 podcasts for us recently in November. And just dating listening to this, I suppose, is that Lisa and I met at the Chartered Institute for Logistics and Transport. We met at the Transport and Safety Forum's event, which was the 10th anniversary. It was super exciting. We both got to meet Princess Anne, which was absolutely amazing as well. And Lisa shared an absolutely fascinating discussion around skill fade, workload and driver distraction, which was part of a project she was invited on by Carl, who is the fleet director for Travis Perkins, and he's also part of the committee, like myself, for organising. So, Lisa, I feel like I've waffled on a little bit and not given you the opportunity to talk. It isn't always like this, I promise. But thank you for joining me, first of all. And I realise I'm calling you Lisa, but should it be Professor Lisa? Is that correct?
No, please. That would make me feel very uncomfortable. Just call me Lisa.
Okay, cool. Lisa. So Lisa is the Associate Professor of Driver Behaviour at Cranfield University and has been doing some work with Travis Perkins, like I mentioned. So, Lisa, are you able to just tell me a bit more about the backstory that sort of led you into becoming your current role, and then also how that led to the work that you've been doing with Carl, which then led on to the event, I suppose?
Okay, so how do I summarise 35 years of research and career?
Yeah, sorry.
In the next 10 seconds. Very briefly, my PhD was in driver behaviour, and then I worked various postdoctoral appointments at various universities around the Midlands mainly, and then I had a senior appointment in industry. And then my present position at Cranfield University, head of the driving research group, was started in 2001. So I've been working in the field of driver behaviour since the 1980s, and so it's a long career. Probably for the last 20 years or so, I've particularly focused on fleet driver behaviour and established a kind of methodology around assessing driver behaviour and providing interventions. More recently, I'm working on automated driving and the problems associated with driving vehicles with the new technology and how people adapt to that.
Yeah, wow. That's it's just mind-blowing, actually, the work that you must have done over this period, and also the evolution of driving, I suppose, as well, over that period of time as well. So what you've started with has no doubt changed and evolved over that period of time. So with regards, so initially, what sparked your interest in driving behaviour originally, if that's okay? What sort of what was that thing that piqued your interest to go, I'm going to go for this as a career?
That's an interesting question, and funnily enough, I've not been asked it an awful lot. It actually came out from a major piece of research that came about sort of like the early 80s, where it was found that human behaviour was the main contributor to crashes. And there was a recognition in the UK in the early 80s that actually we don't have any psychologists that understand driving behaviour, and yet it's becoming kind of the most complex skill that you'll ever perform during the day. And so there was a huge amount of funding that was put forward, and various universities, including my own, were successful in that bid. And so my research was funded by the government to investigate some of the basic psychological principles around why people drive the way that they do and the motivations and so on.
Absolutely fascinating. And I love how you explain something that's so in depth quite succinctly as well. That's very, very well practiced, that must be, Lisa. So the fascinating thing I took away from what you've just said, which I think will really, is something that I just want to point out for the listeners who are fleet and transport managers, right? So you've just said that the most complex task that somebody's going to do, right? But driving is deemed as a low skill role. Now, essentially, we've got pedals, we've got a steering wheel, etc., etc. But obviously, I assume that's because of the complex world in which a truck then operates in, which is other people predicting other people's behaviour, those kinds of things. Am I on the right track, if that makes sense, in where my head's going?
Yes, you are. And, when I talk about complexity, I'm talking about the various layers involved. And just starting with a psychological layer, people's ability to perform quite a complex skill. If you take your mind back to when you first learned to drive, it was incredibly difficult. You're having to coordinate your hands and your feet. You're having to use your eyes very carefully to monitor what's going on around you. But most importantly, you're having to make very rapid decisions, via your kind of complex, brain to try and determine what's actually happening. And then you're having to execute a decision and a maneuver. And so that's the psychological layer, which is in itself, quite complex. And then you layer in, organizational pressures, the traffic system and the demands that are placed upon you, driving a large vehicle, especially in a built-up environment where you've got vulnerable road users and, perhaps you're in an unfamiliar environment. Traffic demands, the complexity is such that you're having to make a lot of decisions constantly. And that's a huge workload for truck drivers.
Absolutely fascinating. So, and absolutely, totally agree with you. So, just because it will have piqued the interest of the listeners, are you able to tell them a bit more about the work that you did with Travis Perkins, where you did a particular study with them?
Sure. So Travis Perkins PLC commissioned me to investigate 3 broad areas, and today we're going to talk about the workload one, and then in subsequent ones we'll talk about the other 2, skill fade and distraction. But the 3 pieces of work that they asked me to do was to thoroughly investigate the academic literature and any related literature that would help them to understand some of the 3, each of those 3 areas in great detail around how the evidence can help them to inform the way in which they manage the risks for their fleet. What does the evidence tell them that they need to do to design the procedures and the policies and the practices for managing risk across those 3 areas.
Fantastic. And that, sounds like an absolutely fascinating study, and I'm looking forward to sort of picking that apart as we sort of go through this podcast series. So we're going to start with workload. Okay, so with when it comes to workload, when I start to think about a transport operation, I think about some of the clients that I work with. I think about these pressures around the time spent on the road, and I think about the different activities that need to be done. I think about the loading and the unloading, and then I think about a potential, because one of the other things as an industry that we're really bad for, and that is compliance says we're allowed 15-hour working shift, because that's the EU driver's hours rules, right? And the law says that you can do 3 of those in a week, and then it's okay because the others you can do 13-hour shifts, and that's obviously an awful long period of time for someone to be operational in a role. Is that what we mean by workload, Lisa?
Well, it's one of the aspects of it. Let's just go back to those psychological demands, because when psychologists have been studying the brain for about 100 years, and they are fully aware of how long it takes the brain to become overwhelmed, where they can't process information any further because there's just literally too tiring for the brain. And actually, some of the research I've done in driving simulators, even after about 20 minutes, you see a performance decrement, that people start to drift out of the lane, their reaction times start to slow. So when you're talking about hours and hours and hours behind the wheel, I know from my laboratory studies alone that is something that you cannot sustain without committing errors. So, what can you do to try and manage that risk? How do you best provide support to drivers to be able to do the kind of very complex job of driving, and manage to stay relatively alert and relatively calm? It's a difficult task.
Yeah, it is, absolutely. So and how do you do that, if that makes sense, Lisa? How do we best help support drivers with this complex task that they've got to do for such a long period of time as well, to try and keep them focused, keep them safe?
Well, yes, absolutely. And it's very difficult, because this is where the organizational layer comes in. Because the company that you work for has enormous pressures, and trying to balance the need for driving safely as well as the need to keep in business are often in conflict with each other. So really, when it comes to, if I just talk about the psychological side of it now, one of the best strategies for making sure that we manage to be relatively satisfactory in our performance of this complex task is to make sure that we don't have a sustained attention for any length of time that can lead to all sorts of problems, like decrements in performance, where the task is requiring you to sustain your attention, perhaps in a very monotonous, boring environment, because naturally the brain will switch off. It becomes there's lack of stimulation, there's no interest, alertness levels start to drift away. So, you have to think about the kind of routes that the driver is on. Some routes have what's called passive fatigue associated with them, where there is that tendency to have this low level of stimulation, and people start to get bored and switch off and start distracting themselves with other types of activities. And then there's this active fatigue that you're likely to encounter in a built-up environment, with this constant stream and bombardment of events and stimulation, effectively, in this built-up environment, that is causing you to suffer with a kind of a fatigue through excessive workload in a different kind of way. So in terms of your solution, you have to think about the environment that you're driving in. Some environments require increased levels of alertness, like, for example, driving on a motorway, driving at night for prolonged periods. Others would require some level of relaxation, where there's kind of a built-up environment where you're feeling quite stressed and tense. So it rather depends on the kind of environment, really.
Hello, it's Shani from Flagship Partners. We are really proud to sponsor the Fleet Geeks podcast. If you need expert advice or training for your fleet business, make Flagship Partners your first choice. We are really excited to announce the launch of our Transport Manager Academy. With expert development for fleet leaders, we offer fully accredited initial Transport Manager CPC training, CPC refresher, and operator license awareness training, as well as mentoring, support, and professional development beyond the qualification. Our vision is to develop elite fleet professionals.
Yeah, got you. That makes a lot of sense, to be fair, because I know personally from driving, when I just drive in my car as normal and I travel somewhere, say I've driven for an hour, I have this tendency to want to go for a walk or something, and that really helps me, for example, just sort of regain sort of gain my stimulus, I suppose, and just carry on. But I guess one of the challenges is that actually we're pushing drivers to drive potentially in a changing landscape. So 1 minute it could be, I'm assuming, like this motorway where it's fairly passive. The vehicle does a lot of the work for you already because it's got the equipment with cruise control and those kinds of things and all of the additional driver aids which aid this passive element. But then all of a sudden you could be in London and it's a very stressful environment. Anyone who's driven, and I say London, but you could add any city centre in there really, particularly if it's unfamiliar, and you've now got Just Eat and Uber scooters and all of that sort of thing sort of coming in and weaving in and out of traffic, which can be very stressful. So I think the question I'm leading to, which is the stark one that I think listeners will be asking, is 4.5 hours then sounds too long between start of driving to their first compliance 45-minute break. What are your sort of thoughts around that?
Yes, it is. It really is, but this is, the conflicting demand of what the organisation needs and, the personal strengths and weaknesses of being, a driver. And, well, I think there are some various kind of strategies that you could put in place that would help you to be able to manage that task. And, you've mentioned one of them, going for a walk. Actually, physical fitness really does help to alleviate stress and workload. The best thing you can do when you take a break is to go for a brisk walk, actually, because it will increase your levels of alertness and it will kind of restore some of the glycogen that you've lost in your brain through all the decision making that you've had to do. And equally, so would, having a good sleep hygiene where people get plenty of rest, have a good 7.5 hours of good quality sleep at night, having a good diet, that's not full of snacks that are high sugar, high carb. And more importantly, just looking after your well-being, and we know at the conference when I met you there, Peter, that there was lots of people there talking about well-being. That there's lots that can be done to support people, and I talked about the health issues around driving a truck for a living. That you're at much greater risk of developing all sorts of diseases, and so it's in everybody's best interests, that you're healthy when you're at work behind a wheel, because that will not only help you to live longer and more successfully, but also reduce your risk of developing all sorts of stress-related diseases.
Absolutely. And so I think one of the things to sort of point out is fairly obvious, and that is that a truck driver's lifestyle really doesn't align with, or generally speaking, I'm being very general, but it largely doesn't align with what we're talking about here, which is it's unlikely they're going to go for a brisk walk. It's largely likely that they're going to eat service station crap when they do stop and nourish themselves, and that ultimately they probably don't do a lot on the well-being point of view. So I think my next question is around, for people listening, that they can, that what can they do to really improve drivers and the workload and help keep them safe? Is it to actually really go about actively promoting a healthy lifestyle for drivers? Is that sort of where we're heading?
Well, I mean, obviously that's been done before, and there's plenty of posters up in canteens, and yet they're still serving them the pies and mash. But it's really about understanding intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, because what you're trying to do is to get people to buy into the personal need for themselves, and start to get them to recognize the benefits when they don't need to do very much. It's amazing how the body and the brain will respond to relatively short bursts of exercise, 10 minutes. Everybody can spare 10 minutes a day. Just very modest changes can have a massive influence. And I think a lot of people put it in the sort of too hard to do bracket, kind of thinking that they've got to be absolutely perfect and do everything, to change their lifestyle. But just quite modest changes, an extra half an hour in bed at night, an extra 10 minutes of a walk a day, just small baby steps really make a massive difference. And once you've kind of promoted actual activity, not just a campaign that puts posters up or tells people what they should and shouldn't be doing, get them to experience it for themselves and support them, so that you're developing these intrinsic motivations. That's the way forward from a psychological perspective. And I know that works because, decades of research in health psychology, getting people to stop drinking and smoking and doing things that are high risk, it's all been incredibly successful in that sphere of influence. And there's no reason why you can't do the same with the driving population. And I've made it my life's mission. The next thing that I'm moving on to is to do exactly that and promote this kind of the sort of psychological aspects of it, trying to develop people's motives and help them with relaxation and managing stress.
It's amazing. It's you're absolutely right in the campaigns and the posters and those kinds of things. It's lip service, essentially. It is lip service, and ultimately, if we're going to change behaviour, I'm thinking of an amazing book that I read that really made a big difference to me, and that was James Clear's book on atomic habits. I'm not sure if you read it at all, but it's a really, really great book. Atomic Habits is really, really interesting, and it's a bit like what you're saying there, which is, so habits almost sound like they're forced, and sometimes they need to be forced from a well-being point of view. But ultimately, when you say about motivation, is how do we become more motivated to do something? And ultimately, it's by someone having lived experience of the benefits of doing something. So we've got to try and push our drivers to go, do you know what, why don't you park the other end of the car park and actually take that extra 200-meter walk, because that's going to be much better for you. Why don't you not take the lift and take the stairs? Why do you and that's what you're saying, isn't it? It's in these minor adjustments of rather I'm going to stop for a snack, and rather than having a packet of biscuits, I'm going to pick up a bit of fruit this time. And it's just those tiny little decisions that will start to have an impact over time. And then the motivation will come with it, won't it? Because it feels good when you do those things.
That's right.
And then that feel good factor will sort of come with it. But like you say, it's not a campaign, is it? It is actually convincing them to live this stuff and then reflect on the learnings that they find from it.
Exactly. And it's known in psychology as nudging, a kind of a developing behavioral insights, get people to recognize the value of doing these things. And, the feeling that of achievement that you get, again, that sort of intrinsic motivation that helps us sustain a behavioral change, rather than just a kind of a campaign that, just people will do for after Christmas, and then within 3 or 4 weeks it's all forgotten. This is a kind of lifestyle change, but just small steps, manageable.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think, and hopefully I'm not sounding self-indulgent sharing this, but I lost 20 kilos this year, which was really good for me. I was super chuffed with it. But one of the big things that I had was I had this accountability where on a weekly basis, I was having to share with somebody what I'd done, like almost like the calories I'd eaten, the things I'd done. So I guess that's not shaming me, but it's giving me an additional motivation, because I don't want to let myself down, and because I know it's ultimately only me that's being let down, but the benefit of having someone else sort of check that accountability really worked. And interestingly, taken from the book actually, was from Atomic Habits, was that, so I'm a nightmare for biscuits. I love biscuits in the evening. I love a biscuit. And I would go and make tea or coffee for my wife in the evening, probably not coffee, more tea or what have you, but I'd make her a tea in the evening, which is like a nice thing to do, go make her a cup of tea, but the biscuits are in the same cupboard. So I'd go and I'd annihilate the biscuits whilst the kettle boiled. I'd just sit there eating. She'd never know the difference. She'd be like, I can hear the biscuits rattling, I can hear them rustling, and I'd be away eating the biscuits. But just moving the biscuits out of that cupboard to the other side of the kitchen, which is just enough psychologically for me to go, I'm not going to bother walking over there. It was just too easy for me to just go, here's the biscuits right in front of me, and that's part of it. And I think maybe from a driving point of view, is that if you don't buy the food, you're not going to eat that food. If you're going to stock up at the beginning of the week and you're going to take healthy stuff with you, and maybe not take the cash that's going to go and, the little bits of petty cash that you might do to buy that chocolate bar or what have you. It's those things where you set out with the intention. Sorry.
These are all trigger points, and you've identified a classic one there, an environmental trigger. How you go into the canteen and there's a open box of chocolates, there's an open box of biscuits at this time of year. It's there before you know it. You can see your hand reaching for it, and it's whereas if you can remove those kind of triggers to the habit, then you help to break up the habit. And on average, it takes about 80 days, to completely change behavior. But you start to see the benefit of these daily habits within 3 or 4 weeks. How you see yourself as well, as somebody that's achieved something, and so I think there is lots that can be done, from taking responsibility for your own lifestyle, for your own responses to what's going on around you, because a lot of the issues for drivers is that they get caught up in those trigger points. Somebody's driving too close to them, somebody's not letting them out, perhaps the managers being unreasonable, and these are all trigger points. What are your psychological trigger points as well, and reflecting on those, and how could you respond in a different way that would actually make you feel better. And so it's not just the kind of lifestyle choices, but it's the choices that you make when you respond to difficult situations behind the wheel as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I love how you've explained that. To be fair, that's I always think of the E plus R equals O. So the event happens, which you can't control. You control the response, which then creates a positive outcome, ultimately, if you respond in the right way. So it's about making the choice around having a good response to whatever that event is, or the stressor that you're having to deal with. Lisa, I'm conscious of time, and it's been an absolute pleasure chatting to you on the podcast. Is there anything else you want to add? If people want to get in touch with you, Lisa, to find out more, or they're interested in working with you, how can they do that?
Sure, just come onto my website at sidedrivegroup.com. I offer training courses for transport managers and health and safety executives, and various people, driver trainers. And yeah, the course runs every month, so do join me.
I really appreciate that, Lisa. Thank you very much. And I'm super excited to listen to the future podcasts as well. So if you've enjoyed this one, please do stay tuned. There's 2 more podcasts on distraction and skill fade coming your way very soon. Right, I'm going to end the recording there and see you all on the next one. Thanks for listening. Thanks, Lisa, for coming on. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you did, please share with your friends and colleagues too. Join us for free on Facebook with the Fleet Geeks community for transport and fleet managers. Fleet Geeks offers ongoing professional development, networking and mentoring too. So get in touch with me, Pete Rushmer, on any social media platform to find out more.